Welcome to class number 8 for Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we're going to be talking about the syntax of clauses, so let's jump right in. What exactly is a clause? Well, according to most definitions, a clause is a subset of a sentence. So a clause might be, while he was going to the store. It's almost like a fragment, but when we put clauses together, we create sentences. But just like most things in syntax, when clauses go together, they affect one another. Couple phrases to keep in mind as we're talking about clauses. One is hypotaxis. This refers to using words like while or because to show the subordination of clauses, meaning that when you have a clause, it is underneath or subordinate to another clause. It is acting adjectivally or adverbally to describe another part of the sentence or another clause in the sentence. Hypotaxis says that this is introduced by a particular word, a particular phrase, a key phrase. For instance, in Hebrew, it might actually start with the word key, kaf, hirik, yod, indicating that this particular clause is in subordination or is serving another part of the sentence. Occasionally, though, there is no word like while or because, there is no key, there is no asher, there is no lama'an. Instead, we have parataxis, which means that instead of having those words, we have the conjunction, which is used to show subordination. Instead of translating it simply as and, though, we will still translate it as though it is hypotaxic, as though it is introducing a subordination of a clause. But even though that word is not there, the vav is acting in place of it. We also have asyndetic. This means that there are no words to show the subordination of clauses. This is very common in Hebrew, and we have to supply the hypotaxic word into English in order to make the translation make sense. This doesn't mean that the word has been skipped, it just simply means that the word was not required. If the word was skipped, we have a case called ellipsis, where we would have expected a word, instead the word is not there, and it's obvious that the word is not there. This is a little bit different than asyndetic because asyndetic does not require that a word is present. Ellipsis does suggest that the word should have been there, but it is skipped. So we're going to be looking at the subordination of one clause to another and indicating the different relationships that this subordination means when it comes to translation. So let's get started. Often, the clause in a sentence is being used subordinate to another primary clause or the primary verb of the sentence to indicate what exactly the subject is or what it is that is taking place. So here in 1 Samuel 23:13, we're told that to Saul it was reported that David had escaped. That David had escaped is what is reported to Saul, but it's not the direct object. In this particular case, because who God is the verb, this is actually functioning very similar as the subject. That David had escaped was reported to Saul, Saul being the indirect object. And so in this particular case, we could make the argument that the clause is being used as the subject. Oftentimes, the clause is being used in apposition to explain another noun. So in Deuteronomy 13:15, we're told that you should surely strike the inhabitants of the city. The rest of the verse then unpacks the inhabitants. Again, asyndetic, there is no indication that the clause has started, but it is clear that it is describing the inhabitants. Occasionally, it is used as a predicate nominative, usually following the word this or is in order to indicate what this is. So in Genesis 6:15, it says, "This is how you should make it," indicating how the ark is to be built. The rest of the verse fills in the details of what this is. How should they actually make it? Using this as a predicate nominative, almost functioning as the subject, but because the word this is the subject, we say that it is a predicate nominative. All of the nominative or the nouns in the predicate are being used to unpack what exactly the subject is of this particular verse. However, it is not always in order. So in Ecclesiastes 5:4, we don't actually get the clause of the direct object until the very end of the verse. And so we need to be careful that we don't just simply assume that because something immediately follows the verb or the subject, that it is the clause. In this case, et asher, tidor, shalem is actually at the very end of the verse. So be careful that you pay what you have vowed. This is unpacking that verb that you should pay what you have vowed. What should I pay? You should pay that which you have vowed. But again, the direct object clause does not come to the very end of the sentence. This is a case of hypotaxis because we have the direct object marker that is indicating what the direct object is, even though it's not actually translated. So again, three very common usages, four if you count the direct object clause, of clauses in syntax. Many times a clause will be used as a genitive, almost like apposition, almost like construct phrase, describing a particular noun in the sentence. So in Genesis 39:20, we're told that Joseph was put in prison, and then we're told what the prison was, a makom asher, a place where the king's prisoners were put. So we're given more detail about that particular prison. Again, this is asyndetic. There is no introduction to the phrase other than asher, but the clause actually starts with makom, which is why we say it's asyndetic. Sometimes the clause will be used as a direct object, such as Genesis 6:5, indicating what it is that God saw about the wickedness of Israel, started not with et, like a direct object phrase, but with ki, kaf, hirik, yod, indicating what it is that God saw. And finally, we have an adverbial clause where it says that Joshua came upon them, but he came upon them suddenly, having marched all night. And it's that last phrase, kol halayla Allah min ha-Gilgal, that explains what it is that Joshua was doing. He was marching all night. So adverbial, explaining how he came upon them suddenly. Oftentimes, a clause will be used circumstantially, giving us background information to a main clause of the verse. For instance, we might use this temporally to give actual background information of previous events, but it may just simply be parenthetic detail, giving us details that we need to know in order for the sentence to make sense. The three clauses here could be translated all as temporal, but in at least Deuteronomy 5:23, it's also possible that it's simply information that we need to know. So while we're told that they heard the voice of the Lord from the darkness, we're also told that the mountain was on fire. V'hahar bo'er ba'esh. This is a paratexic clause using vav to introduce the subordinate clause, and we could translate it as while, that the mountain was burning while they were hearing, or they were hearing while the mountain was on fire. And yet, on the other hand, we might just simply note that the mountain was on fire, which is what some of the translations do, maybe inserting the word for the mountain was on fire. It's circumstantial information that could be taken temporally or simply seen as important information that is circumstances related to that main clause about hearing the voice from the darkness. In Genesis 24, verse 56, we have a clear indication that the events that are being spoken of took place prior to the current action. So Eleazar is speaking to the brother and the mother of Rebekah here, and we're told by Eleazar that the Lord has prospered his way. Va'adonai hitzliach darhi, prospered my way. This is background information. In fact, some translations translate it as he has prospered my way. Again, that antecedent information temporally prior to the main events. In Genesis 18, verses 17 and 18, we have not a past event, but a future event, as God is speaking about whether or not he should tell Abraham all that he's going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah, seeing that he is going to become a great nation, and that nations are going to come from him, and that he's going to be a blessing to all upon the earth. Verse 18 is really circumstantial in the future to verse 17. Should I tell Abraham, seeing that all of this will happen in the future? So it's both temporal but also circumstantial. It's giving those circumstances that are necessary to understand for the rest of the text to make sense. Occasionally, clauses are used and related to each other conditionally. We've already talked about this when we talked about key clauses, so I'm not really going to give any examples here, except to say that in conditional clauses, the if statement is usually called the protasis, and the when statement is usually called the apodosis. Oftentimes, and most commonly, although occasionally there are exceptions, when a negative outcome to the conditional is expected, we use a negative, lu, or some form of lu. It might be lual, it might simply be lu, oftentimes using that lamed plus a shurik, but occasionally a lamed plus a kibbutz added on to al, which is aleph plus a lamed, indicating that we don't expect the condition to take place. Usually, ki, the kaf, hirik, yod, or im, aleph mem with a hirik, are used if we actually expect the conditional to take place. There are a few exceptions where ki or im are used for a negative outcome, but most often they indicate a positive outcome. Again, I'm not going to give you any examples of conditionals because we've seen those multiple times, but just keeping in mind that this is technically a syntax of clauses, where the second clause is conditional upon the first. Oftentimes, clauses are used to indicate the purpose or the result of the previous clause. So that. Oftentimes, this uses the word on the account of, lama'an, or because, ki, or other similar usages, but occasionally we have a parataxic use of the vav plus a cohortative or adjussive. So that in Genesis chapter 27, verse 4, we read, "And bring it to me, and I will eat." Although this is, "you bring it to me so that I can eat," that parataxic use of the vav. So this is a result. Isaac will eat of the food that Esau brings to him. Occasionally, though, it's not a result. It's actually despite or although the previous circumstance has taken place, which is the case in Genesis chapter 18, verse 27, where we are told about the word that is coming to Abraham about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says to God, "God, please listen to me. Let me ask you or say something to you, even though I am but dust and ashes." So this is almost a concessive use, although it's again parataxic because it's vav, va'anoki afar, va'efer, and I am dust and ashes. Although again, it would be taken concessively, even though I am but dust and ashes. Again, giving that background circumstance, but really concessive despite the background circumstance. Please listen to what I have to say. Probably the most common sort of clause is the relative clause, which starts with who, that, which. So in Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, we're told, "For that place which, asher, you are standing upon is holy ground." Here, asher is introducing who, that, which. This again is a clause which is explaining place, but really the whole clause is seeking to further unpack the key clause here of why it is that they need to take their shoes off, in this case, Moses, in front of the burning bush. Sometimes, though, within Hebrew, especially later Hebrew, it's not asher which appears, it's simply sh, the shin. So here in Judges 8, verse 26, we have she'al, and we're told that the garment, the purple garment, which was upon the king of Midian. So which was upon is sha'al. Who, that, which? Similar to asher plus al. Again, these are relative clauses. This is probably the most common type of clause within Hebrew, just as it is in English, unpacking what it is that's being described using who, that, or which. Clauses can also be used to indicate the desire or the wish of the person who is speaking. In Job 14:13, this is done using an odd construction, mi yiten, literally, who will give, which is translated as an idiom, oh, that you would give. And in this case, he wants to be hid in the grave. Sometimes the desire is used with lu, if only, as in a negative that is not currently the case. So in Numbers chapter 22-29, Balaam prays, "Oh, that there was a sword in my hand," which is good that there's not, or else he would have killed his donkey who is talking to him at this point. But again, it is a desire that about something that is not currently the case. Occasionally, though, a clause can also mean unless, almost like a conditional, such as in Genesis 32:26, where we read that Jacob will not leave God or will not let God leave until he blesses him. This is ki'im, using as that as a unless is an acceptive case. I will not let you go unless you bless me. So again, three more usages of the clause in syntax. We have talked about many different usages of the clause in the syntax of Hebrew. We've touched on quite a few, although this is certainly not exhaustive. But one last category I would like to talk about are equation clauses, or clauses that are classifying or identifying. They often include the word is or are. Typically, if the subject is first, we have an issue of identity, such as Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. I am Elohei Avika. I am the God of your father. This is God speaking, of course, to Moses. This is an identity, I am, Anoki, coming first. In Joshua 2:17, though, the subject comes second, and it's classification, not identification. This is the class of anachnu. We are nakiyim. We are innocent. But again, not an identity. Not all innocent people are we, but classification, we are in the category of innocent. Again, these clauses in all cases may be parataxic, starting with a vav, or asyndetic, starting with nothing. Or they may have their particular word, a share, key, or any other word that's introducing a clause. But we at least need to be aware of the different possibilities of translation and how the clauses are being used as we consider the syntax. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's lecture. Again, not exhaustive in the different types of clauses, but hopefully an introduction in terms of the way that different clauses can be used in subordination to the main clause of the verse. We have touched on a lot of them, and hopefully you'll be able to deduce what some of the other options might be. The biggest thing that we need to do, though, is identify that clause in our verse, and the subordinate clauses that go under that main clause, and then ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the subordinate clause and the main clause? Well, that's just about it, so we will wrap it up now. Don't forget to study your vocab, prepare your passage for class, and I will see you soon.